Peter, Bryan, and Jesse, thanks so much for being here. Very excited to chat with you about All Man. I was just mentioning a little bit, this was such an interesting film to watch for me because I didn't realize how interconnected so many pieces of the history of All Man are with other topics, other documentaries that I've seen recently. I just recently saw the Automat documentary last year with, Automat, Horn and Hard Art. And when that popped up in All Man, I was like, oh man, this is crazy. They really had their hand in everything.
Kind of true.
Yeah. Jesse and Bryan, though, let's start off there. Congratulations, Jesse, especially on the feature debut. What led you both to be interested in telling the story of International Male?
Well, it's funny because Jess and I were working on another film about growing up in the age of AIDS, and it was a very heavy topic, and we'd been working on it for about a year or so. And he came up to me one day with a bunch of these catalogs, International Male catalogs, and I had never seen them before. And I was like, what are these? And they were these 1980s catalogs, and the men on the cover, and and looking through, and these clothes were just amazing and wild, and the men were so hot, and just I was like, what is this? What happened to this? And what is this about? And and Jess is like, I think that we should make a short film about this. Jess, where do you come from with it?
Well, yeah, I had the good fortune of receiving these catalogs in the mail as a young adolescent. And at first I thought the jocks had sent them to me as like another way to tease me. But nonetheless, I was super excited to have them. And it opened up this sort of fantasy world where I sort of explored my sexuality through the lens of them. So as Bryan was saying, like we were working on this other film, and I was like looking for images of men, of gay men from this period who weren't sort of compromised health-wise, who were not sort of sick and dying. And it was basically I wasn't able to find any really in mainstream media. And when I found these catalogs, it's like I brought them close to my chest, and it was like this special thing where I was like, oh my God, I remember this. And so we thought, oh, we'll make a little funny short film about what this meant to gay men. I always assumed it was gay men who were buying these clothes. I always assumed it was a gay thing. So much to our surprise, as we embarked on the film, did it open up just wider and wider and wider. And that's how it became a feature.
For me, it's funny hearing your story with International Male, that my, I guess, upbringing was around Abercrombie and Fitch, very much the same. Mm-hmm. So as a young gay male, it was that struggle of, do I want to look like that, or am I going into that store for a very different reason? Am I just ogling, the models? Peter, you wrote and produced. How did you get involved? What is it about this project that enticed you?
Well, Bryan was editing a documentary for me about the history of aerospace in Southern California, and was talking to me about, he and his partner Jesse had done 21 interviews, I believe, about the International Male catalog, but they weren't able to get the founder, Gene Burkhart. We met in Los Feliz at a coffee shop, and I'll never forget it because they were talking about, well, it could be a short subject. And I said, no, it could be a feature if we get Gene and Gloria. And I drove down to San Diego to meet with them. And Gene, my God, this is 35 years after he had sold International Male, and he was about to turn 90 and had not told his story. But I said, you've got a great story to tell here. And it's about the relationship, really. To me, what was interesting is the relationship between Gene and Gloria and this unlikely band of outsiders. They hired people who had been kicked out of their families. They themselves had traumatic early stories in their own early lives that brought them together. And I thought, my God, this is a great human interest feature for everybody. And as I said earlier, I called it All Man because it really is for all humanity. It's not just a gay film.
Yeah, and I think that comes out in the way that you're exploring International Male, especially with, it's kind of the birth of the metrosexual in a way, and dressing snazzier than before. And, at one point, this made me laugh out loud. Someone mentioned the women wanted to get their men decked out for the disco, which was just really entertaining. But then, as you're saying, on the subsurface, there was a whole nother level to what the catalog was really doing, and who it was appealing to. In speaking with the former models and the executives, was there a sense of, wow, we really started all this, we lit the fuse for the demand of this remarkable fashion?
No,
that was
in a way, but no, like from the sense of like a fashion standpoint, I mean, obviously there was really nothing in the marketplace, when they started. It was very nascent, and so from that angle of it, I think yes. And I think, from the angle of, as they were, especially in that 80s period, they were really offering things to men in a way that was not available, in one place. This type of clothing, a wide range of clothing geared towards men being able to express themselves, express their masculinity, express their sexuality. They knew that. They knew what they were doing in that way, but there was nothing in, in their minds, conscious in any way that what they were doing would affect men, affect society, affect culture.
Gloria, Jean's partner, Gloria Tomita, all the time said, good God, you're talking about all these issues about what's this toxic masculinity, gay culture. She said, we were just trying to sell clothes. And in fact, Gloria said, I just wanted to get a good picture, meaning I find this garment, and if I can create a good picture, we can sell that article of clothing. And Jean would come up with a name like Aussie Rower, and then they would have to come up with a garment to go with the name Aussie Rower. It's like I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Sam Arkoff came up with the title and then said, okay, now make a movie. That's how they operated. They were just trying to sell clothes to men, not just to gay men.
And while that's all true, I can't help but sort of go back and think it's an American success story in so many ways, the story we tell. And it's about queer people. It's about different people coming together, a la the Band of Outsiders. At the same time, Gene was a real visionary, and I want to give him props, whether it was sort of accidental or not. I think he was true to his vision, and his vision was to create a world that made it sort of safe to explore self-expression in a way. And to Peter's point, like, it was about, this Aussie Rower, it was about this caftan, it was about these things that sort of took you on a journey. He really capitalized on taking this catalog, and rather than shooting it in a studio, how men's clothing was shot, they were shot on location. They were shot to tell a story and to take people on a journey and try to make it safe in a way. And that's why it was safe for me from a queer perspective too, was because it didn't say gay anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
It didn't label itself. It just said, hey, look what you could be. You could be the guy from the Duran Duran video. You could be Don Johnson from Miami Vice. You could be Fabio from the Butter commercials or romance novel covers. And I think that's one of the most surprising things that was sort of startling to me, was like realizing the women, straight women, were their biggest consumers.
Yeah.
Wasn't at all what I had anticipated, and that was what I brought. And that's why we all felt so much like it needed to be a much broader story about just what they were up against, because the same things they sort of struggled against were a sense of legitimacy on some level. Like, he wanted them to be considered fashion. He saw this as fashion for mainstream people. And it bucked up against, and I think the film explores this a lot, this idea of being labeled a gay catalog. In fact, that's in part why it took so long to get Gene on board, was because when I approached him at first, I said, oh, I love what your little catalog did for gay people. It was sort of like, oh, damn, like, I know there's that part of it, but I wanted to do more. And I think that this journey that in this collaboration we've all been on has been really wonderful in sort of expanding this story. And I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by the story. I'm excited about that.
It took each of us bringing our own perspectives, because what Jesse's just saying, yes, Gene and, oh God, it's a gay story. Gene and I bonded over, he watched a documentary I'd done on Johnny Carson, who, for those in the audience, was a host of something called The Tonight Show from 1960 to 90. And he saw that and said, oh, okay, you can make a documentary. It won't be a gay documentary. It will be a documentary. And I think that had something to do with it. And I hadn't even thought about it until Jesse just made that comment about Gene. And I think each of us brought something to the table that made this film, you know, what it is. It couldn't have been done, I think, any other way than with the sensibility Bryan had, Jesse had, and I had, and the film benefits from each.
That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that this through line of this sort of this struggle for legitimacy, or this line of like, of what's queer and what isn't queer, is what makes me so interested in the film and the topic. Because it goes from this unconscious thing in the early years of like, you know, the Gene years, like just shoot from the hip and like, I was in Morocco once and wasn't it great? Let's tell a Morocco story. And it becomes this really, when it becomes corporate, if you will, it becomes very conscious, like, is this going to offend? Is this not going to offend? Can people get into this? And I think that that's what's so interesting, because it sort of creates this whole sort of marketing juggernaut, if you will, where we see this everywhere now. Like, we always are told about lifestyles and stories, and that's how we sell things now.
And I think what you're speaking to is when Horde and Hard Art came in, and I think it was Peter Carroll that took over, he really was very intentional about not hiring gay photographers and wanting to make that distinction. And I think that was kind of fascinating to me to see, because while it had been a consideration, or at least it's how it's discussed in the film, that it's been a consideration of how do we kind of toe that line, the models that you spoke with never seemed uncomfortable, never seemed like they were, you know, being forced to do something they didn't want to do. It seemed like it was such a good environment. So for that to be such a left turn from Gene's vision probably speaks to, you know, wanting to be more profitable and chasing the money. But did that stand out to you at all, or?
Oh, hugely. I mean, that interview, I mean, I remember when we did that interview, and I think with Peter, you know, Peter, that side of it gets complicated in a way, if you think about it. I think there's a few things that are happening though, because just to clarify, Peter didn't take over. Peter had been there for a while. He came up through art direction and eventually became creative director. But what Peter saw and what Peter wanted, and I think if you think about what's happening in the progression also in society at the time, you know, it was really early on like this. It was all friends. Like, the photographer was somebody that, you know, Gene knew. These were all people that had kind of come up. Nobody was classically trained, anything like this. That came later. I think with Peter, when he comes in, what he saw and what he was worried about is he really wanted to get bigger and bigger models. But the catalog had a reputation of being, oh, this is like cheap clothing, or this, you know, there's a gay element. You don't want my, you know, model to be branded. And also, I think a lot of it was the clothing. Like, you know, they looked at it and like, I don't know. But I think ultimately what he was trying to do too was that perspective, like mixing things up, not have it such to be a total sort of gay lens or queer eye, however you want to talk about it or phrase it, and widening it out in that way. And I actually think you're right. Yes, it is for money. It is for market share. It's to get more people on board. It's also to try and get bigger models, sure, which is all about money. And I think this coincides with what was happening culturally. But I think it was actually not, you know, I don't fault the move in any way. I think it's actually kind of a smart move, because you're trying to add perspective. I mean, that was what was great about Rick's story, which is, he did not want to do this. He was looking for a client, but when it was like men in underwear, he didn't want to do it. And his wife was the one that calls him out and says, you're out there shooting, women basically naked in swimsuits. This is like a double standard. And I think what's really kind of amazing about this, from both the models and from employees who were straight, they all changed. They all learned something. They all grew. The way that they had perceived, something that's gay or gay people or all these things really changed and opened up their worlds and changed who they were as human beings. And they really all credit International Male and the family that they were with the reasoning behind their growth and change as human beings.
Absolutely. One thing that was mentioned earlier, Jesse, you had touched on this. Bryan and Jesse, what you guys were working on prior, a film about the AIDS epidemic. There is a poignant stretch in this film that acknowledges the AIDS epidemic and those who passed, those who were involved with the company. And simply watching the interviews during this segment was rather emotional, which I was not expecting in this movie. I was expecting an educational turn, and I suddenly was weeping a little bit as once again we touch on that tragedy. Was it always the intent to include this, or did the interviewees take you there themselves?
Well, I mean, conceptually, on some level, there was this interest. And as a young person, I didn't make the connection of why these images were so safe to me versus the images of seeing men passing with their families or in complicated emotional situations. I think that's something we explored. But I think we were guided by the interviewees, from my perspective, who shared the lives of these people who were no longer with us to be interviewed, and we felt we owed a service to owed their inclusion in this story. I mean, it's so interesting, the AIDS epidemic as a young person growing up, sort of witnessing this all unfolding and happening. It was extremely frightening. It was frightening on a level similar, I think, to COVID when it first started, perhaps, but it was more vague. And I think that, the loss these people had, it was really like they lost family members. It was like members of the team, and they were sort of a family of outsiders. And I don't know, please, someone else pick up on this, because it is so important.
For me, the magic of doing a good documentary is, to me, where one person says something and then it's handed off to the next person who says something, and the tone of their voice isn't jarring. It's like, wait, he just heard what Gloria just said. And there's, in the AIDS section, to me, it's like these people who are living it are telling the story, and it's unfolding as if we're all gathered around a fireplace and they're sharing it. And when, oh my God, Dennis Morey talks about, I just want to say their names. And then Gloria says, and she holds her hand out, well, those are the people you're not going to be interviewing. And then she tears up, and I'm tearing up, and I don't want to gag. And like, but I was so moved, because the way the AIDS story unfolds, it really is in their words, in their time. And it makes the whole thing connected, which reflects the film, where everybody really is connected on this great human level.
Absolutely.
I will say one thing early on. Dennis Morey was one of the first interviews that Jesse and I did. And we always knew the AIDS was going to be an element of the story, because for not on the scale that we're talking about. We knew there was going to be an element, you don't know what, but we knew because a couple of things. A, we were curious what happened with International Male. And so was there something connected with AIDS that happened with International Male? And then we did know that a lot of the people who worked for International Male, whether it was in the stores or the catalog, passed away. So that what we went into when we did Dennis's, Dennis is very vocal. Dennis is very vocal also, about keeping the names and memories of those who were International Male alive. So we knew that going in, but I was the one conducting that interview, and I'll never forget just sitting there, because the thing that's amazing about documentaries, it's very different than fiction films, is you sit there and you receive this energy that the person is giving you, and you take that in, but you've got to be able to take that in and still balance yourself to keep things kind of moving, and and this kind of thing. And that was a very intense moment, and I remember just crying with him and doing that. But that moment when he said those names, I was like, well, that's it. That's this part, because it's also, if most of the time you get one shot to make a documentary on a subject, how that documentary turns out is regardless, usually it's only going to be one time. So we knew that this was the moment to make this, to sort of, to try to memorialize and immortalize in a way these people and their names, so they could be a part of the story, actually. You know what I mean? Like, absolutely, to be a part of the story, because they were, and that was it. To me, they were characters just like that. Like Dennis Covey and Rick Ledford constantly came up in interviews. I mean, the amount of stories I have, about Rick Ledford are crazy that just couldn't make it in. But there's a reason why those people are specifically given their own titles and included in a way to try to bring them to some life, to give them a place in the story, because their voices can't be heard.
Yeah. I mean, I think too, like all this time now, since the sort of, bleakest period of the AIDS crisis, it's like, to Bryan and Peter's point, it's like processing trauma in real time, like hearing them all speak and sort of, that's another great privilege of the documentary. Things unfold and that you unfold with them, and you hear these things and you bear witness to them. And it just was, I think, so cathartic. I remember Jean said to me off camera at some point, I never realized how affected I was in some ways by AIDS. Like, because, you're in the moment, and he's giving some money to a charity or doing a fundraiser, he was certainly making his contribution in San Diego. But I think, having this time, and as we look back on this period of time, we realize just all these lives that were lost and all the stories that they contain and how they affected people. It's a real privilege.
I want to add one thing to this, which is when we were down in San Diego shooting Jean's interview, we had heard rumors before that AIDS may have played a role in the reason why Jean had sold the company, but we could never get a confirmation of this. And we were also told Jean will probably not talk about this, but you might want to, So Peter was conducting that interview and I was running the camera, and I'll never forget, he asked, why did you sell? And Jean just blurted out, AIDS. And Jesse and I immediately look over and we're just like flabbergasted. We're like, This is it. We broke through. It was a big turning point because, he had never talked about it ever. He probably may have mentioned a couple things to people, but overall, nobody knew for sure it was this thing. And to that other point that Jesse was making about the interviews, I'll never forget when Peter was first looking over the material and reading the interviews, he was just like, my God, you guys have done everything here. Like it's just massive, these interviews, and reading through. But he said, but these people have not talked before. They've not been interviewed before. And it comes through in the work. And he's like, and that is going to be huge. And I had not thought about it that way before. Sorry.
It's amazing the stories you'll hear when you ask and give someone that platform.
Well, getting back to Johnny Carson, here I'm interviewing David Letterman, Jerry Seinfeld, the most famous of the famous. And I always use the moment where I know they're saying something that isn't story number 216, because yes, there's an energy, you just feel it. And in my head, I have this statement, so in the show. And Bryan's right. When I was looking at the transcripts, I said, these are people that haven't been interviewed before, and they're just real. And you have to find that nugget where you can let them be on camera and get it all out. And people always tell you what they're going to tell you. They tell you, and then they tell you what they told you. But you have to find that right moment, the right moment where they're totally real. And when you put that on screen, it's gold. And this movie, everybody is real.
You feel the authenticity throughout this film with every conversation, and that's just incredible to see. I know our time's about up. I want to make a left turn so that we don't end on a somber note. But you talked a lot about how layered this film is, and one of the things that is at the core of this film is fashion. And I thought it was really funny when you all were talking about when the film is talking about the poet shirt, the pirate shirt, the puff shirt, whatever Seinfeld called it. Fashion is cyclical. And, international mail pushed the envelope a lot. Do you see a lot of international mail coming back, that type of fashion? And do you think we'll see a poet shirt again?
I say absolutely. I mean, fashion is powerful. And I think how the film ends, in the sort of present and the role social media is playing in self-expression. For everything negative about social media, there's also a positive to it too. And that is, we see tremendous representation of all different lives, trans lives, non-binary lives, queer lives, and hyper-masculine lives on a much greater level than even back then. I think that international mail contributed in a small way to advancing culture and advancing, let's say, male self-expression, for the lack of a better term, through fashion. I think that men aren't as afraid now.
I think that's right. I want to thank you all for being here. Peter, Bryan, Jesse, it's been a pleasure, and enjoy the world premiere at Tribeca. I hope you all have a great time, and hopefully I'll run into you if I'm up there as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Wonderful talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Take care.